The sun was already high when Mary Collins stepped onto the gravel lot of Glacier County Range, a quiet figure in worn jeans and a flannel shirt. Around her, the parking lot buzzed with men unloading heavy rifle cases from the backs of muddy trucks, their shirts tight with muscle and confidence. No one smiled when they saw her, but several smirked, exchanged glances, and lifted their phones without shame. She didn't look like she belonged here. She wasn't wearing tactical gear, didn't carry a personalized rifle, and hadn't spoken a word since she walked past the check-in counter. A few of them laughed under their breath, watching her make her way to the practice lanes, whispering things like, "Who let the librarian in?" and "Someone's grandma got lost on her way to the grocery store." Mary didn't flinch. She placed her borrowed rifle on the bench and adjusted her stance slowly, deliberately, like someone following instructions from memory. Behind her, the murmurs grew louder. Some were filming, probably thinking they'd catch a viral clip of a woman fumbling with a weapon she didn't know how to use. She raised the rifle to her shoulder. For a second, everything went still. Her breathing was steady. Her eyes didn't blink. Then came the crack of the shot echoing across the range. The bullet sliced clean through the center of the target, so precisely placed it looked unreal. The air shifted. Nobody spoke. Mary lowered the rifle, glanced around at the stunned silence, and said softly, almost as an afterthought, "Any other shooting tips?" Mary Collins lived in a little house at the edge of town where the morning sun crept across faded curtains and lit up a kitchen that smelled faintly of old wood and strong coffee. Her days started early, always before 6, with the same quiet routine that gave her a sense of calm. She wore her favorite denim jacket most mornings, the sleeves soft from years of use, and drank coffee from a chipped mug her sister had given her before the accident. She didn't speak much unless spoken to. Not because she was shy, but because silence had become her way of staying steady. At Glacier High School, where she worked as an administrative assistant, people described her as helpful, polite, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays, and stayed late to organize school events. Most days she wore her hair tied back in a simple bun and walked with a posture that seemed unremarkable to everyone around her. What no one noticed was how her eyes always scanned a room first before entering, or how she flinched ever so slightly at the sound of lockers slamming too hard. She never mentioned her past, not to her co-workers, not to the students. Only Ethan, her 17-year-old nephew, knew the truth, and, even then, only the edges of it. He came to live with her after the car crash that took his parents, and though neither of them said it out loud, they saved each other. She made breakfast every morning and reminded him to pack a snack, always with the same quiet affection. He teased her about her terrible coffee and the old radio she kept on the counter, the one that only played country music when it felt like it. They built a routine that worked. Mary would drive to school with the windows cracked open, listening to the wind more than the radio. At work, she sorted forms, scheduled parent conferences, and somehow made even the worst coffee from the teacher's lounge taste halfway decent. People liked her. They trusted her. But they never really saw her. And that was how she wanted it. The less they asked, the easier it was to keep the memories locked away. She didn't display photos from her past. No medals, no uniforms, no trace of the woman she used to be. Just a silver ring on her right hand, thin and smooth, etched with tiny letters no one could read unless they knew exactly what they were looking at. Some nights when the house was quiet and Ethan had gone to bed, she would sit in the dark with that ring pressed between her fingers. Her breathing would slow. Her thoughts would drift to deserts far away and voices she could still hear if the wind hit just right. But then the coffee pot would beep. The dog would bark. Life would return to the present. The teachers at school called her steady. The principal called her reliable. The students called her Miss Collins and thanked her for the extra pencils she kept in her desk drawer. No one ever guessed that she once held her breath for 60 seconds while watching through a scope, calculating wind, speed, distance, and human movement in less time than it takes to blink. Mary didn't need them to know. She had made peace with her past, or so she told herself. But some parts of her never fully settled. Some nights her hands still trembled when someone slammed a door. Some mornings she'd twist that ring a little tighter than usual and stare out the window like she was waiting for something she couldn't name. Ethan saw it sometimes. The way her eyes darkened when a truck backfired. The way she didn't like loud movies or crowds or fireworks on the 4th of July. He didn't ask questions, but he watched her closely like he knew she carried more than she let on. She smiled often, but it rarely reached her eyes. She listened more than she spoke. She loved fiercely, but in quiet, invisible ways. And through it all, she held herself together with the kind of quiet strength most people never recognized until it was the only thing left standing. The Glacier County shooting range stretched out across a dusty field framed by low hills and scattered pine. The lot was already packed by the time Mary arrived, flanked on both sides by lifted trucks gleaming under the morning sun. Their bumpers were lined with stickers that read things like, "Support our troops," and "Real men hunt," as if each vehicle was staking a claim before a single shot had been fired. Men, in tactical vests and wraparound sunglasses, gathered near their tailgates, swapping stories and comparing gear like athletes before a playoff game. Some leaned against their rigs, rifles resting beside them, while others paced with coffee cups and clipboards, calling out to familiar names. The air smelled of gun oil, campfire smoke, and fresh testosterone. Mary stepped out of her sedan and locked the door quietly. She wore plain jeans and a faded button-up, her only gear a modest duffel slung over her shoulder. Her boots crunched on the gravel as she walked toward the check-in tent, trying not to look at the faces already turning in her direction. There were no other women in sight. Not one. Just rows of men, young and old, heads swiveling to watch her with a mixture of confusion, amusement, and mild suspicion. She kept her gaze forward, chin steady as the murmurs began. A few men chuckled and elbowed each other. One lifted his phone and angled it just slightly, pretending to take a selfie, but clearly aiming the camera toward her. Another whispered something and laughed as if they were in on a joke no one had said out loud yet. She handed her form to the man at the table and gave her name. He glanced at her twice before nodding slowly and handing back a numbered badge. His voice was polite, but his eyes didn't quite hide the surprise. Further down the lot, a group gathered near a table full of gear cases. Doug Henderson stood at the center, easy to spot by the way others listened when he spoke. He wore a baseball cap low on his brow and mirrored sunglasses that reflected everything and nothing at once. His arms were tan, solid, and crossed as he watched her approach the practice lanes. Doug had been coming to this range for years. He'd won 4 out of the last 6 county tournaments and never missed a chance to remind people of it. As Mary walked past him, he leaned toward one of his buddies and muttered something just loud enough for her to hear. "Hope she doesn't shoot herself in the foot." The laughter that followed was sharp and immediate. Mary didn't react. She kept walking her pace even, and found her assigned spot near the far end of the range. Her lane was farther from the others, maybe by chance, maybe not. She unzipped her bag and laid out her items. Slowly, hands steady, even as her chest tightened. Behind her, more comments floated through the air. Maybe she thought this was a knitting class. Maybe she's one of those YouTube gals trying to prove something. Someone made a popping sound with his mouth like a gun misfiring, and a few snorted like it was clever. She didn't look up. She adjusted her ear protection and examined the range-issued rifle with quiet care. It wasn't a bad piece of equipment, but the scope was slightly off and the grip worn smooth. She made a few small changes, testing the weight like someone handling an old tool she hadn't touched in years. Doug watched her with interest, though his smile never reached his eyes. He sauntered over, arms swinging loose like he owned the ground beneath him. His voice came easy, loud enough for others to hear. "Hey there, you sure you know what you're doing with that thing?" Mary didn't answer right away. She looked through the scope, adjusted the bolt, and then finally turned to meet his gaze. Her eyes were calm, unreadable. "I'll manage." Doug grinned, not kindly, and took a step closer. "No shame in asking for help, darlin'. This isn't really a beginner's playground." She blinked once, then turned back to the rifle and made no further reply. Doug shrugged and walked away, but his tone lingered sour in the back of the air. Around her, others kept watching, some openly, some behind dark lenses. Phones were still out. Mary twisted the ring on her finger and sat down on the bench. The metal felt cool, familiar. She'd been here before, not in place but in feeling. Surrounded, misjudged, silent. She breathed in slowly and looked downrange. The targets were still. The air was dry. She was alone in a crowd of people who had already decided who she was. That didn't surprise her. It rarely did. The first round of practice began with a sharp buzz from the loudspeaker. Mary stepped into position and lifted the rifle slowly, eyes steady on the distant paper target. The metal was familiar in her hands, but she deliberately adjusted the scope too far left, letting the sight misalign just slightly. The shot cracked across the range and landed wide, punching into the outer ring. She knew exactly how far off it would be. Behind her, someone gave a low whistle, followed by a chuckle that spread through the nearby lanes like wildfire. A voice rang out loud and dripping with sarcasm. Might want to aim for the paper next time. Laughter followed. Doug's was the loudest, but he wasn't the only one. A couple of younger guys mimicked her stance, exaggerating it like a comedy act. One even pretended to trip over his own feet and said something about the dangers of letting school secretaries near rifles. Phones were out again. Mary could feel the lens angles even when her back was turned. They were filming every move, hoping for another bad shot, another awkward moment to share. She chambered another round and fired again, this time landing closer, but still far from the bullseye. "There you go," someone called. "Beginner's luck. Or maybe she's just got her eyes open now." More laughter. The comments weren't clever, but they were loud and constant. Every word chipped at the edges of her restraint. Mary said nothing. She adjusted her posture in the smallest way, a shift only someone trained would notice. But even that earned another round of unsolicited advice. "Your front foot's too far forward. You're gripping too tight. Let the rifle breathe." She could have corrected them. She could have dismantled their technique with a sentence. But she didn't. She just nodded slightly as if taking their tips to heart, and loaded another round with hands that didn't shake, not even once. The worst part wasn't the jokes or the cameras or the condescending tone. It was knowing exactly what they thought of her. They had already decided she was out of place. They needed her to stay small to feel big themselves. Mary bit down on the memory rising in her chest. The briefing rooms where she was the only woman. The first time a mission commander asked if she was lost. The moment she proved them all wrong, and no one ever dared to ask again. But this wasn't war. This was a range in Montana with barbecue smoke drifting in from someone's tailgate. So she kept her mouth shut, missed her next shot on purpose, and let them laugh again. She felt the flush of heat rise in her neck but didn't let it reach her eyes. Her jaw locked tight. She twisted the ring on her finger once and counted slowly in her mind the same way she used to before every mission. 1, 2, 3. She wasn't ready yet. Not for this. Not for them. But the anger they wanted from her, the outrage, the tears, they weren't going to get it. Not yet. She'd spent too many years learning how to wait for the right moment. That night the house was quiet, the kind of stillness that settled in deep like snowfall before dawn. Mary sat alone at the kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence around her. The day played over in her head, not in full scenes but in fragments. Laughter echoing behind her, phones pointed in her direction. The sting of being dismissed by men who didn't know a thing about her yet spoke like they did. She twisted the ring on her finger and stared out the window where the moonlight cut across the backyard like a memory. Her mind drifted uninvited to a different range. Sand instead of gravel, wind instead of smoke, and silence that meant something much heavier. She remembered lying prone on a rooftop, heart steady, sight focused. She remembered making a shot that saved 6 men who never knew her name. She never needed them to. Ethan's footsteps were soft as he walked in, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. He didn't ask why she was awake. He just sat beside her and reached for one of the leftover cookies she'd made 2 nights ago. She watched him chew in silence, grateful for his calm presence. He looked at her not with pity, but with something stronger. He said he was proud of her not for what she'd done out there today, but for going at all. He told her it was brave to stand in a place where you know you're not wanted. Braver still to keep standing when they try to knock you down. Mary felt the tears well, but she held them back. Not out of pride, just out of habit. She looked at Ethan and nodded like something had clicked into place. She kissed the top of his head and told him to get some rest. He didn't say anything else, just smiled and walked back to his room. When she went to bed, she didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling and thought about how long she'd been pretending to be small, how much of herself she'd buried for the comfort of others, and how tired she was of carrying all that weight in silence. The next morning, before the sun fully rose, she opened her dresser drawer and found the crumpled competition flyer Ethan had left there. She smoothed it out on the counter with the side of her hand, then picked up her phone. Her thumb hovered for a second. Then she dialed the number. She gave her name, confirmed her entry, and paid the fee without hesitation. Her voice didn't shake once. When she hung up, She sat still for a long minute. Then she took a deep breath and whispered into the room what she already knew in her bones. No more hiding. The second round began just after 10, the sun climbing high enough to make the metal benches burn to the touch. Mary stepped back onto the line, same plain clothes, same quiet hands, but something in her posture had changed. She moved like someone who had settled into herself. Not flashy, not loud, just centered. The rifle rested against her shoulder like it belonged there, and she took her time aligning the sight. Her first shot cracked out fast, cleaner than any she'd fired during practice. It landed just outside the bullseye, sharp and steady. A few heads turned. A man near the scoreboard raised his brows but said nothing. Doug, standing 2 lanes over, narrowed his eyes and crossed his arms. Mary didn't pause. She adjusted her grip slightly and fired again. The next bullet punched closer, almost touching the center ring. No one laughed this time. The only sound came from the breeze moving across the field and the soft scrape of spent casings dropping to the ground. A voice whispered behind her, "Did you see that she's not missing now?" Someone else replied, "Maybe she got lucky." Mary loaded again. Her face gave nothing away. She wasn't trying to impress. She was just doing the thing she knew how to do. Third shot, even closer. The groupings were tight now, almost textbook. Doug stepped away from his bench and leaned on the barrier, watching her like he was trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly turned on him. The buzz around the range grew louder. More subtle glances. More shifting feet. Phones were up again, but this time the cameras weren't filming to mock. They were watching to see what came next. Mary exhaled slowly and squeezed the trigger. Her fourth shot broke the silence. It hit clean inside the second ring, so smooth the spotter gave a quiet nod before calling it out. Mary let the moment pass, then loaded another. She never looked at the crowd, never checked the reactions. She stayed locked into her rhythm. Doug leaned in and said something to a man beside him. The other man shook his head, confused. Mary fired again. Another solid hit. The shift was happening and everyone felt it. The woman they'd laughed at was now someone they couldn't ignore. Near the water station, 2 competitors whispered about her stance. One said it looked too good to be self-taught. Another pointed out her breathing technique, the way her shoulders never tensed. Still, someone else said she wasn't shooting like that an hour ago. Doug pushed his sunglasses up onto his head and watched her finish the round. No jokes now. Just silence wrapped in tension. Mary collected her things and walked back to the staging area without a word. Her pace was the same as it had been all morning. Behind her, murmurs rose again. "Who is she?" someone asked. Nobody answered, but the question didn't go away. It hung in the air, heavy and waiting. By the time the round ended, Mary's name was on everyone's lips. She hadn't won it outright, but her score was high enough to draw attention. People whispered around the bleachers, trying to make sense of what they'd seen. Doug paced near the equipment shed, muttering to himself. He'd been so sure she was nothing. Now he watched her like she was a riddle that had suddenly stopped playing fair. Someone asked out loud what she did for a living, and another guy said he'd already looked her up. School secretary. Nothing on record. No competitions. No licenses. Just clean and boring. That didn't sit right with a few of them. She was too smooth, too consistent, and most of all, too calm. Not just skilled, trained. The way her breathing never changed. The way her shoulders didn't move when she fired. It was starting to click. Mr. Carter had been standing quietly near the edge of the range, leaning on a cane and watching her with sharp eyes. He was older now, with a graying beard and a jacket patched with old insignia, but his posture still carried a soldier's weight. He stepped forward, slow, but certain. He said he'd seen her kind of shooting before, and it didn't come from weekend hunting trips. It came from long tours and harder choices. He looked at Mary, not asking, just knowing. She met his gaze and gave a small nod. Doug stepped closer, arms tense, voice louder than needed. He asked if she'd served. She said yes. That was all. But it wasn't enough. Doug pushed again, demanded to know where and doing what. That's when Mr. Carter spoke up. He said her name again, softer this time. Then he said another name. The Angel of Kandahar. A few people blinked like they'd misheard. But he didn't repeat himself. He just looked around the crowd and said he'd heard the story back when it passed through the Ranger grapevine. Long shot. High stakes. One woman. 8 lives saved. Mary didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. The silence in the crowd said everything. The shift was complete now. No one laughed. No one filmed. They just stared at her like seeing her for the first time. She didn't stand taller or smile or flinch. She just stood there, whole, unhidden, and finally fully seen. The final round was set against a sky smeared with pale clouds and a wind that wouldn't stay still. The targets were farther now, moving silhouettes on steel tracks that jerked and swayed with every gust. Most of the shooters ahead of her had already missed more than they'd hit. Their shots scattered wide as the wind played tricks on their timing. Mary stood behind the line still as stone, watching each silhouette glide across the range like it was on a slow dance through chaos. Her number was called. She stepped forward and took her place, the sun behind her, and 100 eyes pressing from all sides. She laid her hand on the rifle like it was an extension of her breath. One last check. Sight alignment. Trigger tension. Her boots planted solid in the dust, her shoulder absorbing the weight of it all. Then she looked downrange and saw nothing but her purpose. The first target appeared fast from the left, dipping slightly as the wind shifted. Mary followed it with the barrel, made a micro-adjustment for the drift, and squeezed. The metal cracked. The target snapped backward with a clean hit. Someone in the crowd exhaled too loud. She didn't hear it. Second target moved in a diagonal slide, slower but unpredictable. Her breathing timed with each footstep, her finger resting light and sure. She waited for the wind to lull, caught it on the turn, and fired. Another hit, this one near the top of the silhouette. There was no noise now, not even whispers. Phones were down or forgotten. People stood like they were watching a thread being pulled tight across the sky and didn't dare breathe too hard. The third silhouette came faster, dancing along a tighter path. Mary tracked it calmly, like she was remembering rather than reacting. The shot landed before the target reached its halfway point. The spotter flinched like he couldn't believe it. Fourth and fifth targets fell to her in the same rhythm. She worked like a machine, but nothing about her felt cold. It was grace, not automation. Discipline born from years of stakes higher than scores on a board. By the sixth target, even Doug had gone still. His arms dropped to his sides, lips parted in a quiet shape of disbelief. She was rewriting the entire tone of the day, not with volume or force, but with precision. One bullet at a time. 7, 8, 9. Each shot hit center mass or within an inch of it. She never hesitated. She never blinked. When the final target emerged, a smaller silhouette weaving in a tight figure 8, the tension peaked. The wind kicked hard just as she aimed. Most shooters would have waited. Mary didn't. She calculated the delay, led the movement, and fired in the pause between gusts. The target jerked and stopped mid-track, hit dead center. There was no applause at first, just silence so thick it felt physical. Mary lowered the rifle, stepped back from the bench, and finally looked at the crowd. Eyes met hers. Some in awe, some in shame. All of them changed. She gave no speech, no glance for validation. She simply stood still while the echo of what she'd just done settled into the dirt. The silence finally cracked with a soft murmur. Someone whispered what they were all thinking. It wasn't just skill. It was something else. Something earned. And for the first time that day, nobody questioned why she was there. The silence didn't last long. Charlie Webb, a longtime competitor with a thick neck and louder opinions, stepped forward with a scowl on his face. He said it wasn't right, that bringing someone like her into a civilian match felt like letting a pro athlete dominate a backyard game. A few heads nodded. Doug didn't speak, but his jaw flexed tight. Mary stood still, hands loose at her sides, eyes calm. She looked at them not with anger, but with something deeper, something tired and clear. She said she heard every word from earlier, every joke, every whisper. She listed them one by one, the comments about her stance, the laughter when she missed on purpose, the phones in her face, the snide remarks about what a woman was doing there in the first place. She said none of it surprised her, that she'd been underestimated her whole life, that people like them who felt safe in their assumptions had always been loudest when someone quiet showed up with something real to offer. Then she told them she wasn't mad. That revenge wasn't the reason she came. She came because someone she loved believed she still had something to give, and because part of her needed to stop hiding. Not from them, from herself. She said she didn't ask for special treatment. She followed the same rules, paid the same fee, shot with the same rifle the range provided. What she brought with her was training, but what she carried was restraint. If she'd come to win, they would have known in the first round. If she'd come to humiliate, she would have let that first bullet speak for her. But instead, she chose patience. Because what she wanted wasn't applause. It was to be seen fully and fairly. She paused then long enough for them to feel the weight of her words. She said respect should never come after performance. It should come with presence. You don't have to know someone's story to treat them like they have one. The range stayed still. No one moved. Then slowly someone started clapping. It was Mr. Carter. Then the man beside him joined in. Then more. Doug was last, but when he did, it wasn't half-hearted. He looked at her and nodded like something inside him had shifted. Mary stepped forward and took the trophy from the event organizer. It wasn't big. It wasn't polished. But it was earned. Not for dominance. For dignity. For reminding a crowd of people that skill can be silent. That strength doesn't always announce itself. And that the loudest person in the room isn't always the one who deserves to be heard. The video hit the internet 3 days after the tournament. It started on someone's personal page, just a short clip of Mary's final round, then her speech. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, her inbox was overflowing. News stations wanted interviews. Podcasts wanted sound bites. Veterans across the country sent messages of thanks, many saying they'd never seen anyone carry their history with such grace. Strangers mailed letters, some handwritten, some typed. One woman sent a photo of her own daughter holding a toy rifle saying she hoped she'd grow up to be that kind of strong. Mary read every single one, slowly, gratefully. The town shifted around her like snow melting in spring. People who once glanced past her in the grocery store now paused to smile. Teachers at school left her notes in the lounge. Students gave shy waves in the hallway, then asked if she'd ever missed a target. Doug didn't say much, but his brother, a youth coach at the high school, reached out one evening with an idea. He asked if she'd be willing to teach marksmanship to a handful of students. Not just how to shoot, but how to breathe, how to focus, how to respect the weight of holding something powerful in your hands. Mary didn't answer right away. She looked at Ethan across the dinner table and asked what he thought. He grinned and told her he'd already told all his friends she was cooler than Captain America. Later that night, as they stood washing dishes side by side, he leaned over and bumped her shoulder gently. He said he was proud, not just of what she did, but how she did it, with patience, with backbone, with the kind of quiet power that didn't need to shout to be heard. She smiled soft and full and flicked a bit of soap suds at him, laughing when he dodged too late. The moment was simple, but something about it felt more complete than anything had in years. Mary didn't post much herself. But one night she uploaded a photo. It was of her old coffee mug resting beside a worn shooting glove. No caption, just the image. It said more than enough. She wasn't looking for fame. She didn't want to be anyone's hero. But what she found in the weeks that followed was something she hadn't expected. A sense of place. Not for the soldier she had been. Not just for the woman she'd become. But for both side by side. And when people asked her to speak, to lead, to train, she started saying yes. Not because she owed them, but because she remembered what it felt like to stand alone. And she knew now she didn't have to anymore. Mary said yes to the first request without hesitation. It was a local workshop for women new to firearms hosted in a church basement with paper targets taped to the back wall. She spoke softly, demonstrated slowly, and told them not to rush their strength. More offers came after that. A veterans group invited her to speak. A community college asked her to teach a leadership class. Each time she said yes a little faster, not because she owed the world her story, but because she finally understood the power of sharing it. She no longer shrank when people stared, no longer changed her walk to seem smaller. She let them see her, all of her, and in return something opened. A space she didn't know she'd been missing. Not applause, not recognition, just room to breathe as her full self. She started a small training program with Ethan's help. They built it from scratch. Just a few volunteers, a dusty barn, and some borrowed mats. But it grew quickly. Girls who'd never touched a rifle stood beside boys who had, and both walked away changed. Not because they became expert shooters, but because Mary taught them how to hold still, how to listen, how to be exact without fear. At night, she still kept her old routines, the coffee in the chipped mug, the quiet porch. But now her silence didn't come from hiding. It came from peace, the kind earned slowly after years of carrying more than your own weight. People came to her for advice now, not just about shooting, about steadiness, about fear, about finding the line between who you were and who you are willing to become. She never gave them simple answers, just questions that pointed inward. One afternoon, she sat outside with a clipboard in her lap, going over names of new students. A soft breeze tugged at the edge of her notes. Ethan leaned out the window and told her there was chili on the stove if she wanted some. She nodded without looking up, then smiled. As the sun slipped lower, she pulled her jacket tight and wrapped both hands around her coffee. The sky stretched wide above her. No pressure, no noise, just the steady hum of a life finally lived without apology. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She wasn't running from the past or waiting to be understood. She simply was. And for the first time in a long time, that was more than enough.